On New Year's Eve, Victoria, only 35 years old and the owner of one of the largest tech companies in the country, decided to go for a walk. The city was bustling, but there was something comforting about the chaos around her. Wearing an expensive black overcoat and elegant boots, she wandered aimlessly, observing people laughing, hugging, and awaiting the countdown to the new year. In front of a closed store, under the glow of a street lamp, Victoria stopped upon hearing a soft melody. It was a song played on an old violin, and the tune seemed so out of place amidst the city's noise that it made her pause. Her eyes turned toward the source of the sound, where a woman with dark, disheveled hair, wrapped in a worn-out coat, was playing the instrument with impressive skill. Lila, a young woman of about 28, stood there, immersed in the music she was creating. Her face bore the marks of a hard life on the streets, but her eyes shone with an intensity Victoria couldn't ignore. Beside Lila, a small plastic container held a few coins and crumpled bills left by passers-by. Victoria watched from a distance, mesmerized by the music and the delicate figure of the woman. When the song ended, Lila looked around, as if waking from a trance, and her eyes met Victoria's. There was a moment of silence between them before Victoria stepped closer. "You play beautifully," Victoria said, pulling a $100 bill from her wallet and placing it in the container. Lila looked at the bill in disbelief before raising her eyes again. "Thank you," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "Music is all I have left." Victoria felt a pang in her chest. It wasn't pity, but genuine curiosity. "Did you study music?" Lila shrugged, a small, sad smile appearing on her lips. "I studied a bit before life took me in another direction." Victoria hesitated before asking, "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" Lila raised an eyebrow, wary.
"Why?"
"Are you going to offer me a 5-star hotel?" Lila's sarcastic tone made Victoria smile. "Not exactly. But I can offer you something warm to eat." Lila observed Victoria for a moment, trying to gauge her intentions. Experience had taught her to be cautious, but there was something in the woman's eyes, something genuine. "All right," Lila finally said, putting her violin back into its worn case. They walked together to a cafe that was still open. The place was nearly empty, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. Victoria ordered hot chocolate and 2 sandwiches, while Lila sat in a chair near the window, gazing at the city lights. "So," Victoria began as she placed the tray on the table, "how did you end up here?" Lila looked at the cup in her hands before answering. "It's a long story and not a very interesting one. Let's just say things fell apart." Victoria nodded, respecting Lila's silence. "And the violin? How did it survive?" "It's the only thing that stayed with me," Lila replied with a shrug. "I couldn't leave it behind. It's the only thing that still makes me feel like myself." Victoria remained quiet, feeling a mix of admiration and sadness. She had never imagined that a random night could lead her to meet someone like Lila. There was a strength in her, a light that even difficult circumstances hadn't extinguished. When they finished the meal, Victoria pulled a card from her pocket and handed it to Lila. "If you need anything, call me." Lila took the card, looking at it curiously. "Victoria Hawthorne," she read aloud. "You're one of those powerful women, aren't you?" "Something like that," Victoria replied, chuckling softly. "Well, Victoria Hawthorne," Lila said, tucking the card into her pocket. "Thanks for the meal." Victoria wanted to say more, ask more, but Lila was already standing up, the violin case slung over her shoulder. When Lila walked out the door, Victoria felt an unexpected emptiness. That night, as fireworks lit up the sky, Victoria returned to her apartment, but her mind wasn't on contracts or next year's meetings. It was on the woman she had met, on the intensity of her music, and the quiet strength in her eyes. For the first time in a long while, Victoria felt she wanted to know more about someone, and that scared her as much as it fascinated her. The days following New Year's Eve were a mix of restlessness and curiosity for Victoria. No matter how hard she tried to immerse herself in her routine of meetings and contracts, the memory of Lila lingered in her mind. There was something about the woman, her resilience, her music, and even her sarcastic tone, that Victoria couldn't forget. The card she had given Lila remained, a silent promise. But, to her surprise, Lila hadn't called. Victoria wondered if she had lost the card or simply chosen to ignore it. The idea that Lila might have returned to the streets without help deeply troubled her. Finally, unable to resist her restlessness, Victoria decided to do something she had never done before. She went back to the same place where she had first met Lila. The biting cold of January made the city feel even harsher, but Victoria pressed on, determined. When she reached the block, Victoria heard the same soft melody that had stopped her on New Year's Eve. And there was Lila, in the same spot, playing the violin with the same intensity that seemed to carry her entire soul. Victoria stopped a few meters away, watching. She realized that, despite the difficult setting, there was something incredibly dignified about Lila. When the music ended, Victoria approached slowly, clapping softly. "You didn't call," Victoria said without preamble. Lila looked up at her, surprised, but not entirely. "Did you really expect me to?" "I did," Victoria replied firmly. "And you?" "I thought it didn't make sense," Lila admitted, putting the violin into its case. "What could someone like you want with someone like me?" Victoria hesitated before answering. "I wanted to help." "Why?" Lila asked, narrowing her eyes. "Are you one of those people who do good deeds to ease their conscience?" The question was harsh, but Victoria faced it with honesty. "Maybe," she said. "But in this case, I think you're more interesting than anyone I know." Lila laughed, a soft and surprising sound. "Interesting is a funny word to describe a homeless person." "It's not what you are that interests me," Victoria replied, her eyes locked on Lila's. "It's who you are." For a moment, neither of them said anything. There was something heavy in the air between them, something that felt larger than either could explain. Victoria insisted on taking Lila for another warm meal, and to her surprise, Lila didn't refuse. This time, they went to a small restaurant away from the city center, a place Victoria often visited when she wanted to escape the world. The space was cozy, with soft lighting and a crackling fireplace. While they waited for their food, Victoria asked more questions. "Have you always lived here in New York?" "Not always," Lila replied, absent-mindedly fidgeting with her napkin. "I came here a few years ago. I thought it would be easier to start over in a big city where no one knew me." "Start over?" Victoria asked, curious. Lila shrugged. "Things fell apart in my life. I lost my home, my family, and myself for a while. But you still have your music," Victoria pointed out. "Yes," Lila replied, with a small smile. "The violin was the only thing I managed to save. It reminds me of who I was before everything went wrong." Victoria was silent, feeling a wave of admiration for Lila. "You're stronger than you think." Lila chuckled softly. "I don't know if strength is the right word. Sometimes surviving is just keeping on breathing." "Even so," Victoria said seriously, "you have something most people in my world don't." "And what's that?" Lila asked, curious. "Authenticity," Victoria replied. "You're real." The conversation continued late into the evening, and when they left the restaurant, the night was cold but clear. Lila seemed more relaxed, more at ease than Victoria had seen her before. "You don't have to go back to the streets," Victoria said as they walked. "I can help you find a place to stay." Lila stopped, looking at Victoria cautiously. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." "Maybe I want to know you," Victoria replied sincerely. "And maybe I think you deserve something better." Lila shook her head, as if she still couldn't believe Victoria's kindness. "You're strange, you know that?" "I've been told," Victoria said with a small smile. Lila sighed, crossing her arms against the cold. "I can't promise anything, but I'll accept the help." Victoria felt a wave of relief and something deeper, a sense that she was doing something meaningful, perhaps for the first time in a long while. That night, Victoria arranged for Lila to stay in a small nearby hotel and promised to meet her the next day. As she returned to her apartment, Victoria realized something was changing inside her. Lila was more than a good deed. She was a presence Victoria wanted to keep in her life, no matter how complicated it might become. And for the first time in years, Victoria felt that the new year could truly bring something new. Victoria woke early that morning. For the first time in years, she felt something different in her otherwise predictable routine. Lila's name lingered in her mind, like a song that refused to fade. Sitting at the kitchen table of her luxurious apartment, with a cup of coffee in her hands, she mentally revisited the previous night. Lila was unlike anyone Victoria had ever met. Her honesty, her light sarcasm, and the way she maintained her dignity even in the hardest circumstances were disarming. Victoria picked up her phone, already resolved. She would call Lila and make sure she was all right, keeping her promise to help. Lila, for her part, woke up in the small hotel room Victoria had arranged. The space was simple but comfortable, something she hadn't experienced in a long time. For a moment, Lila just sat on the bed, looking at the soft light streaming through the window. Victoria's kindness had initially made her wary, but now there was something else. Something she couldn't name. When the room phone rang, Lila answered hesitantly. On the other end of the line, Victoria spoke firmly. "I hope you slept well. I want to pick you up later. We have a lot to figure out." "Figure out?" Lila replied, frowning. "That sounds more like a mission than a conversation." Victoria laughed softly. "Take it however you want, but I'll be there at 3. Lila smiled despite herself and agreed. In the afternoon, Victoria arrived at the hotel promptly. Wearing an elegant coat and with a determined expression, she found Lila already waiting outside. The contrast between the two was obvious. One exuded sophistication, while the other seemed like someone trying to find a new footing. Yet there was an ease in how they walked side by side. In the car, Victoria finally asked, "Is there any place you'd like to revisit? Somewhere important to you?" Lila hesitated before answering. "There's a park, a place where I used to play before things got harder." Victoria nodded and drove to the location. When they arrived, Lila seemed lost in thought. The park was quiet, with tall trees and wooden benches. Lila held the violin case as if it were a talisman, and Victoria, sensing the moment's significance, said nothing. Lila walked to one of the benches and began to play. The melody filled the space around them, drawing curious glances from a few passers-by. Victoria stood, watching. There was something profoundly moving about Lila's music, as if every note told a story of pain and hope. When Lila finished, she looked at Victoria, a small smile on her face. "At least I still have something to offer." Victoria sat down beside her. "You have a lot to offer. More than you realize." Lila looked away, uncomfortable with the compliment, but grateful. "You're different, you know? I don't understand why you're doing this for me." "Because I want to," Victoria replied simply. "And because I feel like you deserve it." The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with a tacit understanding between them. Before they left, Victoria suggested going to a nearby restaurant for dinner. During the meal, their conversations flowed more easily. Lila shared more about her past, about how her violin had been the one possession that endured the devastating changes in her life. Victoria, in turn, opened up about how her professional success hadn't filled the emptiness she often felt. "You know," Lila said, leaning slightly over the table, "people think money solves everything. But from what I see, it doesn't fix anything that really matters." Victoria pondered for a moment before responding. "It fixes some things, but it doesn't buy meaning or happiness." Lila smirked, joking, "If that's true, maybe you're wasting your time and money on the wrong person." "I completely disagree," Victoria replied with a soft smile, her gaze steady on Lila's. When they left the restaurant, Victoria offered Lila a ride back to the hotel, but Lila hesitated. "You know I can't rely on this forever, right? I don't want to just be a responsibility to you." Victoria stopped, looking at her seriously. "You're not a responsibility. You're someone I want to help because I believe in you." Lila felt the sincerity in Victoria's words and nodded. "Thank you." "Really?" On the drive back, the car was quiet, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. When they reached the hotel, Lila looked at Victoria before getting out. "I don't know what comes next, but you're the first person to make me believe there could be something." Victoria smiled, leaning slightly toward her. "There will be. Together, we'll figure it out." As Lila entered the hotel, Victoria sat in the car for a few minutes, reflecting. There was something growing between them, something unexpected and profound. For the first time, Victoria felt she was doing something truly meaningful. And for the first time, she didn't feel alone. That sensation, as new as it was comforting, was something she knew she wanted to preserve. The next day, Victoria decided it was time to give Lila more than promises. After a quick call to a contact, she arranged an interview at a small music school looking for someone to teach extracurricular lessons. She knew Lila needed more than a hotel room. She needed a chance to rebuild her life. When Victoria called Lila that morning, she was met with a hesitant response. "An interview? For me?" Lila asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "Why not for you?" Victoria replied firmly. "You have talent, Lila, and they need someone with your skills." "I'm not sure I'm ready," Lila said, her uncertainty clear. "No one's ever really ready for anything," Victoria said with a smile. "But you can do this, and I'll be there to help." After a deep sigh, Lila agreed. "All right. But if this goes badly, you owe me dinner." Victoria laughed. "Deal." That afternoon, they met in front of the music school building. It was a modest but welcoming place, with walls decorated with drawings of musical notes and instruments. Victoria lightly held Lila's hand as she encouraged her to step inside. The director, a kind man named Mr. Gordon, greeted Lila with a warm smile. He asked her to play something on the violin as part of the interview. Lila, initially nervous, closed her eyes for a moment before starting to play. The melody she chose was simple but filled with emotion. When she finished, the silence in the room was followed by applause. "You have a rare gift," Mr. Gordon said. "We'd be honored to have you on our team." Lila looked at Victoria, who gave her an encouraging smile. "I'll take it," Lila said, almost unable to believe it. In that moment, something changed in Lila. For the first time in a long while, she felt hope. As they left the school, she looked at Victoria, her face lit with a genuine smile. "I don't know how to thank you," Lila said, holding Victoria's arm. "You don't need to thank me," Victoria replied. "You just need to believe in yourself." That night, Victoria took Lila to dinner at a riverside restaurant to celebrate the new job. The atmosphere was serene, with soft lights reflecting off the water. Lila seemed more relaxed than Victoria had ever seen her. "Do you realize how much you've changed since we met?" Victoria asked, looking at Lila with admiration. "I feel like I'm starting to change," Lila replied. "But I think it's because you believed in me when I couldn't." Victoria reached across the table, taking Lila's hand. "It's not just that. You have a strength many people will never have, and I admire that." For a moment, they sat in silence, their eyes connected in a way that said more than words ever could. Lila gently squeezed Victoria's hand, feeling a connection she'd never experienced before. A few days later, Lila began her new job. Teaching music to children brought an unexpected joy to her life, while Victoria continued to support her every step of the way. Their relationship grew naturally, evolving from an unlikely friendship into something deeper and more intimate. One evening, as they walked through the park where Lila used to play, she stopped and looked at Victoria. "Did you know you were changing my life from the very beginning?" Victoria smiled, tilting her head. "I just knew you were changing mine." Lila laughed softly before stepping closer and hugging Victoria. It was a simple moment, but one full of meaning. For both of them, it felt as though the emptiness they'd carried for so long was finally being filled. Their journey was just beginning, but the path ahead seemed clearer than ever. Months passed since Lila started working at the music school. Her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined on that cold New Year's Eve. She now had a purpose, a routine, and most importantly, someone who believed in her unconditionally. Victoria, in turn, had also changed. Lila had brought color to a world that once seemed like nothing more than a series of cold, calculated days. That evening, as autumn leaves gently fell, Victoria invited Lila to dinner at her home. It was Lila's first time visiting the luxurious apartment on Park Avenue. When she entered, she was surprised by the warm simplicity of the place. Despite its obvious wealth, Victoria's home had a cozy feel. "It's beautiful here," Lila said, walking to the windows that offered a stunning view of the illuminated city. "It's less empty now," Victoria replied with a soft smile. As dinner was served, the two of them talked about everything: the progress of Lila's music lessons, the challenges in Victoria's work, and even the small, everyday moments that had once seemed insignificant but now carried newfound meaning. After the meal, Lila picked up the violin that Victoria had insisted she bring. "Play something for me," Victoria requested. Lila smiled, tilting her head slightly. "Anything in particular?" "Surprise me," Victoria replied. Lila began to play a soft and enchanting melody, something that seemed to translate into notes all the feelings they had for each other. Victoria closed her eyes for a moment, letting the music fill her. When Lila finished, the silence in the room was as profound as the connection they shared. "You surprise me every day," Victoria said, walking over to Lila. "And you've given me reasons to believe again," Lila replied, setting the violin aside. Victoria took Lila's hands, her eyes locked on hers. "I never knew I could feel this way. You've changed everything." Lila smiled, gently squeezing Victoria's hands. "And you gave me everything when I had nothing." Victoria leaned in slightly, and they shared a gentle kiss, filled with meaning. It wasn't just a moment of passion, but a silent promise of everything they could still build together. Years later, Lila and Victoria had found a perfect balance between their differences. Lila had expanded her work, teaching music to children in underserved communities, a source of immense pride for her. Victoria, in turn, dedicated herself to supporting Lila's projects, using her resources to make music accessible to more people. On a sunny afternoon, they strolled through a park, now accompanied by a little girl with curly hair who ran joyfully between them. Sophia, their adopted daughter, was the heart of the family they had built together. As they watched Sophia run, Lila held Victoria's hand. "If you had told me that night on New Year's Eve that my life would be like this, I would have laughed at you." "I never imagined my life would take this turn either," Victoria replied, smiling. "But I can't imagine it any other way now." Lila rested her head on Victoria's shoulder while Sophia laughed in the distance, picking up leaves from the ground. The future still held its challenges, but they had discovered something that strengthened them. A love born from the most unlikely circumstances, but, over time, had proven to be unshakable. And with that, they continued writing their story, one note at a time, like a song that never ends. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Comment below what type of story you'd like to see in the next video.